People bury the dead so they may rest in peace. My husband, legally declared dead for 41 years, disagreed. 6 months ago, he knocked on my door. Do you think this is a miraculous reunion? A tale of love conquering time? You're wrong. This is the story of a truth buried for nearly half a century. A truth that, when unearthed, didn't heal a single thing. It only destroyed. I am not the naive 24-year-old woman he left behind. I am Mary Elizabeth Walker. I am 69, and I have learned that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes, it comes from the victim's own hands. The story I'm about to tell is not about waiting, but about retribution. It's not about love, but about the most sophisticated deception you could ever imagine. It began with a knock on the door and ended with me having to make a decision no wife, no mother should ever have to face. Before I pull back the curtain of secrets, subscribe and leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from. Because some stories, no matter how painful, must be told. This story begins when I was a 24-year-old girl back in 1979 in the city of San Marcos, Florida. In those days, America was very different, my dears. Women my age, from a working-class background like me, had very few options. We either married young or we'd end up as old maids, as they used to say. I worked in a garment factory earning very little, but I was independent, and I liked that a lot. Brace yourselves, because what I'm about to tell you is not just the story of a reunion after 41 years, but the story of a woman who learned that it's never too late to make the right decisions, no matter how much your heart aches. Because believe me, after so many years of waiting, after so much suffering, what happened when he knocked on my door changed my life forever, but not in the way you might imagine. My dears, for you to understand this whole story, I have to take you back to San Marcos in the late 1970s. I, Mary Elizabeth, was the second of 5 children in a working-class family from the San Marcos neighborhood. My father, Mr. Henry Walker, worked in the railroad yards, and my mother, Helen, was a homemaker who sometimes sold homemade pies on weekends to help with expenses. In those days, San Marcos was a city growing with textile mills and the railroad industry. Families like ours lived in simple wood frame houses with big yards where there was always laundry hanging out to dry and hibiscus plants that my mother cared for as if they were her children. The smell of cinnamon and brown sugar always floated in our kitchen because my mom loved to make homemade sweet tea. I finished high school, which in those years was a big deal for a working-class girl. My dad always said, "An education is the one thing nobody can take away from you, sweetie." So he sacrificed to make sure my siblings and I could study. When I turned 18, I got a job at the Sunshine Garment Factory, where they made fabric for clothes and tablecloths. I earned $85 a week, which in 1979 wasn't bad at all for a single girl. The factory was about a 20-minute walk from my house. Every morning at 6 o'clock sharp, I'd leave with my lunchbox that my mom packed with a ham and cheese sandwich, a bag of chips, and some coffee sweetened with sugar in an aluminum thermos. The noise of the machines was deafening, but after a few months, I didn't even notice it. We worked from 6 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon with a half hour for lunch. At the factory, I met my best friends, Rose, a girl from a small town upstate who lived with her aunts, and Hope, who came from a very large family in the center of town. The 3 of us were single, hard-working, and full of dreams. On Fridays, after getting paid, we'd go downtown to walk around the main square, watch people, and have an ice cream cone in the park. On Sundays, after the 8 o'clock Mass at San Marcos Parish, the whole family would gather at my maternal grandparents' house. My Grandma Ruth made the best fried chicken in all of San Marcos. And my Grandpa Joe would tell us stories from the Great Depression while we drank coffee with chicory. At those family gatherings, there was always music by Johnny Cash or Dolly Parton playing on the battery-powered radio. My life was simple but happy. I had my job, I helped at home with expenses, and on Saturday nights, we sometimes went to a dance at the community center. In those years, girls had to be home early, no staying out late on the streets. My dad was strict but fair, and he always told us that as long as we lived under his roof, we had to respect his rules. Young people my age had fun very differently than they do now. Boys had to ask a girl's parents for permission to court her, and if they wanted to go out with her, it had to be in public places and with a chaperone. The soap operas of the time were As the World Turns and General Hospital, which my mom and I watched religiously on the black and white television my dad had bought on credit from Sears. The music we listened to was by Elvis Presley, Frank Sinatra, and Aretha Franklin. The radio always played romantic songs that made all us girls at the factory sigh. Hope always said she was going to marry a man like Elvis who would sing sweet things in her ear. And Rose dreamed of moving to the big city to see the world. Courtships in those days were very formal. If a boy was interested in a girl, he first had to talk to her father to ask for permission to visit her. Then came the Sunday visits in the living room with the whole family present, where they would get to know each other while drinking coffee and eating cookies. If everything went well, after several months, they could talk about a formal engagement. I was a shy but hard-working girl. I was about 5'4". I had light brown hair that reached my shoulders, and I always wore it in a ponytail for work. My mom always said I had pretty, deer-like eyes, a hazel color that I had inherited from my Grandma Ruth. I liked to dress simply but cleanly, skirts to the knee, long-sleeved blouses, and on Sundays I wore my navy blue dress with white flowers that I had bought with my first paycheck. In those days, I was in no hurry to get married. I enjoyed my independence, my friends from work, and helping my family. My salary was enough to buy myself a new blouse from time to time, go to the movies on Saturdays to see John Wayne or Lucille Ball films, and save a few dollars for the future. My mom always said, "Honey, marriage will come when God wants it to. In the meantime, study, work, and become a good woman." But as the saying goes, when you least expect it, love arrives. And love came into my life on a Tuesday in February 1979, in the form of a man who would change my destiny forever. Although at that moment I had no idea of everything that was about to come. It was a Tuesday in February, exactly the 13th of February, 1979, the day before Valentine's Day, when I met Robert Anthony Miller. I'll never forget that date because it was the day the most beautiful and most painful story of my life began. That day, a new guy arrived at the factory, recommended by the brother of Mr. Peterson, our supervisor. Robert was 26 years old, from rural Georgia, and had come to San Marcos looking for work because things were very difficult back home. He was tall, about 5'10", with a fair complexion, a well-groomed mustache, as was the style back then, and brown eyes that crinkled up like raisins when he smiled. He always wore his black hair neatly combed with Brill cream and smelled of aqua velva, that aftershave all the working men used. The first time I saw him was when Mr. Peterson introduced him to all the girls on my production line. "Ladies, this is Robert. He'll be working in the fabric warehouse, so you'll be seeing him around here often." Robert took off his gray felt hat, gave a little bow, and said in that deep voice that went straight to my soul, "Good morning, ladies. It's an honor to work with you." Rose nudged me in the ribs and whispered, "Oh, Mary, what a handsome man." But I pretended not to notice. Robert was very hard-working and respectful. He arrived every day at 6:10 in the morning, always well-dressed in navy blue jeans, well-ironed long-sleeved shirts, and his polished work boots. During the first few days, he only greeted us with a polite "good morning" when he passed through our area to deliver the fabrics we needed. But I noticed that he always found excuses to pass by where I worked, whether he needed to check an order, count the rolls of fabric, or if Mr. Peterson had asked him to check on something or other. And every time he passed, he would look at me with a shy smile that made me nervous. Hope, who was very observant, would tell me, "Oh, Mary, that boy has his eye on you. You can see it a mile away." One morning in early March, Robert approached my machine with a roll of very pretty floral fabric, the kind we used to make tablecloths. "Miss Walker," he said, "Mr. Peterson asked me to ask you if this fabric is okay for the special tablecloth order." I checked the fabric, which was perfect, but he just stood there, as if waiting for something more. After a moment of awkward silence, he said, "Excuse me for asking, but aren't you from a family that lives over in San Marcos?" I said yes, and then he told me that he had seen my dad at the railroad yards and had asked about him. "Your father is a very respected man," he said. "The guys speak very highly of him and your family." At that moment, I knew that Robert had been asking about me, and that thrilled me, although I tried not to show it. "My dad is a good man," I replied. "He's always taught us to work honestly." Robert smiled and said, "It shows you come from a good family, Miss Walker." That conversation was the beginning of everything. From then on, Robert found any excuse to talk to me during work. He asked me about my family, about San Marcos, about my interests. I told him about my siblings, my job at the factory, my love for American movies. He told me about Georgia, about his family who were farmers, about his plans to settle in San Marcos to build a better life. Robert came from a family of small farmers. His father, Mr. Reuben Miller, had a small piece of land where he grew corn and beans, but the droughts of the last few years had been very hard. His mother, Doña Soledad, had died when he was 15, and his father had remarried a woman who didn't care for him much. That's why he had decided to look for opportunities in another city, to send money home, and to build a future for himself. "I don't want to spend my whole life working the land," he would tell me. "I want to learn a trade, have a steady job, start a family." When he said that about starting a family, he would look at me in a way that gave me butterflies in my stomach. Hope and Rose always teased me. "Mary is in love." They would sing during our break, and I would turn as red as a tomato. After almost a month of talking during work, Robert finally decided to take the formal step. It was a Friday in April, and that day I had received my paycheck of $95. They had given me a raise because I was a good worker. As I was packing my things to go home, Robert approached me very seriously. "Miss Walker," he said, "I'd like to ask you something very important." My heart started beating like a drum. "Could you give me permission to speak with your father? I'd like to ask for his authorization to visit you at your home." Oh, my dears. You can't imagine the thrill I felt at that moment. It was what I had been waiting for without daring to admit it. "Of course, Robert," I said, trying to sound calm. "We're home on Sundays after 1 o'clock. He smiled from ear to ear, put on his hat, and said, "Then this Sunday, with your permission, I will go speak with Mr. Henry." That weekend felt endless. I told my mom about Robert, about his intention to come and speak with my dad. My mom, who was very wise, told me, "Honey, that boy seems serious and hard-working, but remember that courtship is for getting to know each other well. Don't get your hopes up too quickly." My dad, when I told him, just said, "We'll see what kind of man he is when he comes to show his face." On Sunday, he arrived dressed in his best clothes, a dark brown suit, a white shirt, a navy blue tie, and his well-shined patent leather shoes. His hair was perfectly combed, and he brought a bouquet of red carnations for my mother. He presented himself to my father with great respect. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker. I'm Robert Anthony Miller. I work at the same factory as your daughter Mary, and I've come to ask for your permission to court her." My dad invited him in, offered him coffee, and they talked for about half an hour in the living room while my mom, my siblings, and I listened from the kitchen. Robert told him his whole story, where he came from, why he had come to San Marcos, what his plans were, what his intentions were with me. My dad asked him many questions about his family, his work, his ideas about marriage and responsibility. At the end of the conversation, my dad told him, "Robert, you seem to be a serious and hard-working young man. You have my permission to visit Mary on Sunday afternoons here at the house with the family present. If after getting to know each other well, you are both sure of your feelings, then we will talk about commitment." Robert shook my dad's hand, thanked him for his trust, and gave me a look full of happiness. And so began our formal courtship. Every Sunday after lunch, Robert would arrive at our house dressed to the nines. He would sit in the living room with the whole family. We'd have coffee and cookies, listen to music on the radio, and talk about everything. He would tell my dad about his work. My brothers would ask him about Georgia, and my mom would always offer him more coffee and more cookies. After 2 months of Sunday visits, my dad gave us permission to go out together, but always with a chaperone. We would go to the movies on Saturday afternoons, always with Rose or my sister Susan as a chaperone. We watched movies with John Wayne, Steve McQueen, or those Lucille Ball comedies that made us laugh so much. Robert always bought me popcorn and an orange soda, and afterward, he would walk me home slowly so we could talk longer. In September of 1979, after 5 months of courtship, Robert asked me to marry him. It was a very special Sunday, my 24th birthday. He arrived at the house more nervous than usual, and after the family meal, he asked my dad for permission to speak with me alone in the backyard. He knelt beside my mom's hibiscus pots and said, "Mary, these months have been the happiest of my life. I want to marry you, start a family with you, make you happy for the rest of my life. Will you be my wife?" Of course, I said yes. I was completely in love with this good, hard-working, respectful man who treated me like a queen and had clear plans for our future. That afternoon, Robert formally spoke with my dad to ask for my hand. My dad gave him his blessing, and my mom cried with emotion. We set the wedding date for the 15th of March, 1980, to give Robert time to save money and for us to prepare everything. The months of our engagement were beautiful. Robert worked tirelessly to save money for our new life. We rented a small house in the Morelos neighborhood with 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a small but very nice yard. On weekends, we would go together to buy basic furniture: a brass bed, a simple dining set with 4 chairs, a wooden wardrobe, and a gas stove that was the pride of the house. My friends from the factory threw me a very nice bridal shower. We went to eat at a restaurant downtown. They gave me things for the house, and Rose embroidered some beautiful napkins with our initials. Robert also had his bachelor party with his co-workers, but nothing over the top, just a meal at a diner near the factory. On our wedding day, the 15th of March, 1980, the morning was sunny and cool, perfect for a ceremony. I wore a simple but elegant white dress that my mom and my sister Susan had sewn for weeks. Robert was incredibly handsome in his new charcoal gray suit and a royal blue tie. We got married at St. Mark's Parish at 11 in the morning, with our closest family and friends present. Father Martinez, who had baptized and confirmed me, celebrated the ceremony. Robert had improved his reading to be able to do the readings during the Mass, and I carried a bouquet of white lilies that my younger sister, Lily, had picked out at the flower market. During the exchange of vows, Robert whispered in my ear, "I promise we will be very happy, my love." And I believed him with all my heart. The reception was in the backyard of my parents' house. My mom and my aunts prepared a feast: barbecue chicken, potato salad, baked beans, fresh cornbread, and the most delicious 3-layer cake you've ever tasted. We played country music on the biggest battery-powered radio we could borrow and danced until the sun went down. Robert and I opened the dance with "Can't Help Falling in Love" by Elvis Presley, and my eyes filled with tears of happiness. That night, we began our married life in our little house in the Morelos neighborhood. Robert had filled the whole house with flowers: red roses in the bedroom, daisies in the kitchen, and white carnations in the living room. "Welcome to our home, my queen," he said as he carried me across the threshold. At that moment, lying in his arms, smelling the fresh flowers and feeling so much love, I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world. Oh, my dears, if I had known then what life had in store for us, perhaps I would have held on to those moments of happiness even tighter. But in March of 1980, newly married and full of dreams, all I saw ahead was a long and happy life with the man I loved. The first months of marriage were indeed the most beautiful of my life. But as it always happens, life had other plans, very different from ours. The first 2 years of marriage were like a dream come true. Robert and I were very happy in our little house in the Morelos neighborhood. We would wake up together at 5:30 in the morning. We'd have coffee with milk and a donut that I'd buy from Mr. Evans' bakery and walk together to the factory. In the afternoons after work, we'd go to the market to buy what we needed for dinner, and we'd spend the evenings talking in the yard while he helped me hang the laundry or I mended his work clothes. Robert was the husband every woman dreams of. He helped me with the housework, never came home drunk. He would bring a local trio to serenade me on Friday nights, which he hired from the main square, and every payday he would buy me something nice: a cheap but nice-smelling perfume, a new blouse, or chocolates that I loved. On Sundays, we went to church together, visited our families, and in the afternoons, we would sit in the living room listening to radio dramas while I embroidered, and he read the newspaper. In January of 1982, we received the most beautiful news of our lives. I was expecting our first baby. Robert was so happy that he shouted with joy and carried me, spinning me around the house. "We're going to be parents, my love. We're going to be parents," he repeated as he kissed my forehead. That same night, we went to tell our families, and my mom cried with joy while my dad patted Robert on the back and said, "Now you're going to know what it's like to be a real man." Son. During my pregnancy, Robert was the best husband in the world. He bought me the strangest cravings, like pickles and ice cream at 10 o'clock at night or hot dogs from a street vendor on Saturdays. He would rub my feet when they swelled. He accompanied me to all my appointments with Dr. Hernandez at the community clinic, and at night he would talk to the baby while stroking my belly. "My little boy," he would say to my womb, "your daddy is waiting for you to teach you how to be a good man, to take you fishing in the river, to play football in the yard." If it was a girl, he would say, "My little princess, you're going to be as beautiful as your mother. I'm going to spoil you so much, and no boy will ever disrespect you because your daddy will always be watching over you." Those conversations filled my soul with so much happiness that sometimes I would fall asleep smiling. Our son, Robert Anthony Jr., was born on the 15th of September, 1982, the same day as Mexican Independence Day. Robert Sr. was so emotional that he didn't stop crying from the moment he heard the baby's first cry. "He's identical to you, my love," he told me, as he held our son for the first time. "Look at his perfect little hands, his beautiful little face." The baby was chubby and pink, with a full head of black hair and huge eyes whose color we didn't know yet. The first months with the baby were intense but beautiful. Robert would get up with me in the middle of the night when the baby cried, helped me bathe him, and would spend hours just watching him sleep. "I can't believe this little angel is ours," he would tell me. He had requested a week of vacation from the factory to be with me and the baby, and those days were among the happiest of our married life. When little Bobby turned 6 months old, in March of 1983, strange things started to happen that I didn't understand at the time. But now, so many years later, I can see them as the first signs that something was wrong. Robert Sr. started coming home later from work. At first, he would tell me that Mr. Peterson had asked him to stay late to organize the warehouse, or that he had to help with an urgent order. He also started going out more often with his coworkers. "I'm just going to have a beer with the guys," he would tell me on Fridays after dinner. "I won't be long, my love, just an hour." But that hour would turn into 3 or 4, and when he returned, he would smell of beer and sometimes even whiskey. I would gently complain, and he would say, "Oh, my love, don't be jealous. A man needs to socialize with other men from time to time." In May of 1983, for the first time in our marriage, Robert came home very drunk. It was a Saturday night. I was feeding the baby when I heard someone knocking insistently on the door. When I opened it, there was my husband, leaning against the door frame, with glassy eyes and disheveled hair. "Hello, my beautiful queen," he said, slurring his words. "Aren't you going to give me a welcome kiss?" I was very scared because I had never seen him like that. My dad would sometimes have a beer on Sundays, but never to the point of getting in that state. "Robert, what happened to you? Why are you like this?" I asked as I helped him inside. He collapsed onto the living room sofa and said, "We were celebrating with the guys from work. George is getting married next month, and we threw him a party." The baby started to cry because the noise scared him, and Robert yelled, "Shut up, kid, my head hurts." That was the first time Robert yelled at our son, and it was also the first time I felt a cold chill in my stomach, as if something had broken inside me. Thinking back, I still wonder how I could have been so blind. To all you young women listening, please trust your gut. When your man changes, don't lie to yourself and say it's just a difficult phase, because that cold feeling in the pit of your stomach, it never lies. "Robert, don't yell at the baby," I said. "It's not his fault you've been drinking." He looked at me with eyes I didn't recognize and said, "Don't scold me like you're my mother, Mary. A man has the right to drink when he feels like it." He got up from the sofa, staggering, and went to bed without eating dinner, without kissing me goodnight, without apologizing. From that night on, the late arrivals and drunkenness became more frequent. Robert started coming home drunk 1 or 2 days a week, always with different excuses. It was a coworker's birthday, there was a promotion at work, the guys had organized a barbecue. I tried to talk to him when he was sober, but he always told me I was exaggerating, that he didn't have a problem with alcohol. Exaggerating? I would say. "Robert, the baby gets scared when you come home yelling. I don't sleep well when you're not here, and besides, we're spending money we need for the house." He would hug me, kiss me, and promise that everything would change. "My love, forgive me, you're right. I won't drink like that anymore, I promise. It's just that my coworkers sometimes insist a lot, and I don't know how to say no." But the promises lasted very little. The following week, it was the same thing all over again. In June of 1983, Robert came home one night so drunk that he threw up in the backyard. I had to clean it all up while he snored in bed. The baby was crying because he was hungry, and I felt completely alone and confused. "What is happening?" I asked myself. "Why is my husband changing so much?" In July, things got worse. Robert started missing work on some Mondays because he was hungover from the weekend. When Mr. Peterson reprimanded him, Robert came home very angry and yelled at me, "It's all your fault and that kid's fault. A man can't live peacefully in this house." I started to cry, and instead of comforting me, he grabbed his hat and went to the bar again. One night in August, Robert came home so late it was almost dawn. I hadn't slept at all, waiting for him and worrying. When he came in, besides being drunk, he had a scratch on his face and a torn shirt. "What happened to you?" I asked, terrified. "None of your business," he answered. "You'd better start making breakfast, I'm hungry." That day, I talked to my mom and told her what was happening. My mom advised me to be patient, that Robert was surely going through a difficult phase and that with love and understanding, he would get through it. "Men sometimes feel pressured when they have to support a family," she said. "Give him time, honey, and pray a lot for God to enlighten him." I listened to my mom because in those days, women believed we had to put up with everything for the good of the family. In September of 1983, when our son turned 1, Robert was practically no longer living at home. He would come home to sleep very late, get up late, and go to work in a bad mood. He hardly spoke to me, hardly played with the child, and when I asked for money for household expenses, he gave me less and less. "I'm running out of money," he would say. "Life is very expensive, and my salary isn't enough." I began to suspect that Robert was spending almost his entire salary on alcohol. The few dollars he gave me were barely enough for basic food and the baby's milk. I had to start asking my mom for help to pay the rent and to buy the clothes the baby needed because he was growing so fast. In October of 1983, I decided to go to the factory to talk to Mr. Peterson to ask if he knew what was happening to Robert. Mr. Peterson received me in his office with a very sorry look on his face. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "I wanted to talk to you. Robert has been missing a lot of work, and when he does come, he sometimes smells of alcohol. I've tried to talk to him, but he tells me everything is fine at home." "No, Mr. Peterson," I said with tears in my eyes. "Things are not fine. Robert is drinking a lot, and I don't know what to do anymore." Mr. Peterson advised me to try to convince Robert to seek help, but he also warned me that if things didn't improve, he would have to fire him for missing so much work. That night, I waited for Robert to talk to him about what Mr. Peterson had told me. When he arrived, more or less sober for the first time in weeks, I told him the whole conversation. Robert became furious. "You went to talk about me behind my back?" he yelled. "How dare you go and embarrass your husband?" That night we argued until very late, and for the first time in our marriage, he slept on the living room sofa. The next day, Robert went to work without having breakfast and without saying goodbye to me. When he returned in the afternoon, he had a very serious face. He sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Mary, we need to talk." My heart started beating very fast because I had a feeling that something very serious was about to happen. "I've decided to leave San Marcos," he said without looking me in the eyes. "Things here are not going well. I need to look for better opportunities somewhere else." I was frozen. "What do you mean you're leaving? What about us?" I asked. "The baby and I are going with you." Robert was silent for a very long moment, and then he said the words that changed my life forever. "For now, I'm going alone. When I get settled and find a good job, I'll come back for you." My dears, at that moment, my world fell apart. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Robert, we're a family," I said, crying. "You can't just leave us like this." He hugged me, but I felt that this hug was different, as if he were already saying goodbye. "It's temporary, my love," he said, "just until I get things sorted out. I promise I'll be back for you and the baby in a few months." That night, Robert packed his few belongings in an old leather suitcase that had belonged to his father. The next day, very early, before the sun was fully up, he said goodbye to me and our son. "Take care of yourself, my love," he said, kissing my forehead. "Take good care of our son. I'll write to you often, and I'll send money whenever I can." The baby was asleep, and Robert kissed him gently without waking him. "Where are you going?" I asked through tears. "First to Georgia to see my dad, and then probably north, to Jacksonville or Tampa. They say there's a lot of work in the factories there." That was the last conversation we had. Robert took his suitcase, gave me one last kiss, and walked away down the street of our neighborhood as the sun began to rise. I stood there in the doorway of my house, holding my 1-year-old son, watching the love of my life. That doorstep. It haunted me for years. In that moment, I realized our house was no longer a home. It was just an empty shell. And the weight of an entire life, my son's and my own, suddenly crashed down on the shoulders of a 25-year-old woman. That night, I cried not because I missed him, but out of sheer terror, walk away forever. At that moment, I thought he would come back, that he was really only leaving temporarily. I never imagined that would be the last time I would see Robert Anthony Miller, until 6 months ago, when he knocked on my door after 41 years of absence. The first few months after Robert left were the hardest of my life up to that point. I was 25 years old, with a baby just over a year old, and suddenly I found myself completely alone. The first few weeks, I waited for news from him every day. Every time I heard footsteps on the street, I would run to the window, thinking it was Robert coming back. Every time the mailman came, my heart would race, hoping for a letter with news. The first letter arrived 3 weeks after he left. It was very short, written in his handwriting that I knew so well. "My dearest Mary, I hope you and the baby are well. I arrived safely in Georgia. My dad is sick, and I'm helping with the harvest. As soon as I'm done here, I'm heading north. Like I said, I'm sending $50 that I was able to save. Kiss the baby for me. Your husband who loves you, Robert." Those $50 were like water in the desert. It had been weeks since I had spent my last dollars, and I had been living on the food my mom brought me and the little I earned doing laundry for others. I ran to the bank to cash the money order. I bought milk for the baby, beans, rice, and I even had enough to buy him a jacket because the November cold was starting. The second letter arrived 2 months later, in January of 1984. Robert was writing from Jacksonville. "My love, I finally made it to the city. The trip was very hard, but I'm here now. It's very expensive here, but there's a lot of work. I got a job in a clothing factory. They don't pay much at first, but they say they'll give raises soon. I'm sending $75. Give the baby lots of kisses. I'll be able to come back for you soon, Robert." I received that letter with great joy. $75 was more money than I had seen at once since Robert left. Besides, he sounded optimistic, as if things were really getting better. I wrote him a very long letter, telling him how our son was growing, that he was already walking on his own and saying Dada and Mama, that my parents were taking good care of him, that I was in good health, although I missed him terribly. During the first 6 months of 1984, Robert wrote me 4 more letters and sent me money on 3 occasions. The amounts were irregular, sometimes $50, sometimes $100, once it was $40. But at least I knew he was alive and that he remembered us. In his letters, he told me he was living in a rented room with other workers, that the work at the factory was very hard, but he was learning, that Jacksonville was a city very different from anything he had ever known. Meanwhile, I had to completely rebuild my life. I went back to live with my parents because I couldn't afford the rent on the little house in the Morelos neighborhood. My sister Susan, who was already married, let me stay in her old room with the baby. It was humiliating to have to go back to my parents' house as a married woman with a child, but I had no other choice. My dad never said anything reproachful, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. He had trusted Robert, had given him his blessing to marry me, and now his daughter was back home, abandoned with a small child. My mom, on the other hand, showered me with affection and helped me take care of the baby so I could work. I got a job doing laundry for wealthy families downtown. I earned very little, about $20 a week, but it was the only thing I could do without leaving the child at home all day. On Mondays and Wednesdays, I went to Mrs. Eleanor Lewis's house, a retired teacher who lived near the cathedral. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I worked for the Johnson family, who owned a grocery store and needed me to wash the employees' uniforms. On Fridays, I helped my neighbor, Mrs. Davis, wash the clothes of her boarders. She had a boarding house for railroad workers. The work was very hard. I had to scrub the clothes on a concrete washboard using bar soap and a stiff bristled brush to remove the toughest stains. My hands became red and chapped from the soap and cold water. In the winter, it was especially tough because I had to wash with icy water and my hands would bleed from being so chapped. But the hardest part wasn't the physical labor, but the loneliness and uncertainty. At night, when I put the baby to bed and was left alone in the room, I would wonder when Robert would return, if he would really return, if things would ever be like they were before. Sometimes I cried so much I had to cover my face with a pillow so my parents wouldn't hear me. In August of 1984, after 3 months without receiving letters or money, I started to get seriously worried. I wrote to Robert at the address he had given me in Jacksonville, but my letter was returned with a stamp that said, "Addressee unknown." I asked at the post office, and they told me it meant that Robert no longer lived at that address. In September, I received a very strange letter. It wasn't from Robert, but from a man named Walter Sanders. The letter said, "Mrs. Miller, I hope you and your son are well. I am a co-worker of your husband, Robert, at the factory. He asked me to write to you because he injured his right hand in a machine and cannot write for now. He is in good health, but he will be unable to work for several days. As soon as he gets better, he will write to you himself. Robert says he loves you very much and misses the boy a lot." That letter reassured me a little, but it also worried. I still remember the feeling of reading that letter. My dears, something was just so wrong. In what world does a kind coworker write a letter to help, but not leave an address or a phone number to get back to him? My mind clung to that hope like a drowning woman to a piece of wood, but my heart was already growing cold. Why hadn't Robert found a way to write to me himself, even with his left hand? Why hadn't he sent me his new address? Why had it been 4 months since he sent money? I decided to write a letter to this Walter Sanders to ask for more details about Robert's accident. My letter was also returned. Addressee unknown. It was then that I began to suspect that something very serious had happened. I talked to my dad and told him my worries. My dad, who was a very practical man, told me, "Honey, I think that man abandoned you and doesn't have the courage to tell you to your face." I didn't want to believe that, but with each passing day without news from Robert, the doubt grew stronger in my heart. I needed to know if my husband was alive, if he planned to return, or if he had definitively abandoned me. With the savings I had scraped together for months doing laundry, I bought a bus ticket to Jacksonville. I left the baby with my mom. He was too young for such a long trip, and I went alone to look for Robert. It was a 2-day trip on an uncomfortable bus, sleeping, sitting up, eating sandwiches my mom had made, with my heart full of hope and fear. When I arrived in Jacksonville, my dears, I realized that finding one person in that city was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Jacksonville, in 1984, was a huge city, full of workers from all over the South who came looking for work in the factories or trying to make a new start. There were hundreds of factories, thousands of rented rooms, dozens of neighborhoods where the workers lived. For 3 days, I went from factory to factory asking for Robert Anthony Miller. In some, they told me he had worked there but not anymore. In others, they said they had never had an employee with that name. In a clothing factory, a supervisor told me she remembered a Robert from Georgia, but that he had left around September and she didn't know where he went. I also went to the boarding houses and rented rooms where the workers lived. I described Robert, tall, fair-skinned, mustache, from Georgia, and some people would say, "Oh yeah, I think I knew someone like that, but he doesn't live here anymore." It was like chasing ghosts. It was as if Robert had existed, but had disappeared without a trace. On the 3rd day, tired and desperate, I went to a bar where I had been told many of the factory workers gathered. There, an older man who was drinking a beer told me something that chilled me to the bone. "Ma'am, I knew a Robert from Georgia who worked at the San Luis factory, but that boy got into trouble with some smugglers who move people and goods. The last time I saw him, he was very nervous. He said he had to get out of Jacksonville because he owed money to dangerous people." "What kind of trouble?" I asked. "Well, ma'am, some of the young guys who come from out of town get convinced by these smugglers to get involved in their operations. They promise them easy money, but when they can't pay their debts, they get into serious trouble. That Robert was very scared the last few times I saw him. He said he had to get money fast or he was going to be in serious trouble." I returned to San Marcos with a broken heart. I hadn't found Robert, but I had found clues as to what might have happened to him. Maybe he had gotten involved with criminals and something had gone wrong. Maybe something terrible had happened to him, or maybe he had simply decided to start a new life and forget about us. From that moment on, I stopped waiting for him. I told my family what I had discovered in Jacksonville, and we all came to the conclusion that Robert had probably died or disappeared forever. It was the most difficult grieving of my life. To mourn the death of someone without knowing if they were really dead. To say goodbye to someone without the certainty that they were gone forever. But life had to go on. I had a son to raise, and I had to be strong for him. For the next few years, I dedicated myself completely to raising my boy and rebuilding my life as a single woman. I never heard anything from Robert Anthony Miller again until that afternoon 6 months ago, when after 41 years of silence, he knocked on my door as if no time had passed. For the next few years, I clung to a fragile hope. My mother insisted I wait, that perhaps he was in some trouble he couldn't write about. I focused on Bobby, pushing aside the legal questions. It wasn't until early 1988, when Bobby was starting school and the silence had stretched for 5 unbearable years, that my father finally convinced me. "Mary," he said gently, "you have to move forward, for yourself and for the boy. We need to make this official." Accompanied by my father, I went to the county courthouse. Mr. Martin, an older lawyer who handled family cases, explained that after 5 years without any news, we had a strong case for a presumptive death declaration. The process took over a year. I had to present all the letters Robert had sent, get testimonies from people who knew him, and prove that I had done everything possible to find him. My family, my former co-workers, Mr. Peterson, and even Father Martinez all testified to his sudden disappearance. Finally, in late 1988, a judge officially declared Robert Anthony Miller legally dead. For the next few years, I clung to a fragile hope. My mother insisted I wait, that perhaps he was in some trouble he couldn't write about. I focused on Bobby, pushing aside the legal questions. It wasn't until early 1988, when Bobby was starting school and the silence had stretched for 5 unbearable years, that my father finally convinced me. "Mary," he said gently, "you have to move forward, for yourself and for the boy. We need to make this official." Accompanied by my father, I went to the county courthouse. Mr. Martin, an older lawyer who handled family cases, explained that after 5 years without any news, we had a strong case for a presumptive death declaration. The process took over a year. I had to present all the letters Robert had sent, get testimonies from people who knew him, and prove that I had done everything possible to find him. My family, my former co-workers, Mr. Peterson, and even Father Martinez all testified to his sudden disappearance. Finally, in late 1988, a judge officially declared Robert Anthony Miller legally dead. I received a legal document that allowed me to consider myself a widow and make decisions about property and inheritance. It was a very strange. People called me a widow, but how could I truly be a widow when there was no grave to mourn at? That piece of paper was both a permission slip and a curse. It allowed me to restart my life, but it also forced me to bury a part of my own hope alive. What a strange and bitter moment. On one hand, I felt relief to have legal clarity about my situation, but on the other hand, it was like signing the death certificate of my marriage and my youthful dreams. With the legal document in hand, I could finally start planning my future realistically. The first thing I did was look for a more stable and better-paying job. Thanks to recommendations from the ladies I did laundry for, I got a job as a kitchen assistant at a downtown elementary school. The job paid $450 a month. I had health insurance benefits, and it allowed me to be close to home to take care of my son. Working at the school changed my life. The principal, Miss Gloria Hernandez, was a very educated and understanding woman who became my mentor and my friend. She encouraged me to finish my high school diploma through adult night classes. "Mary," she would tell me, "you are a very intelligent and hard-working woman. Don't settle for washing dishes your whole life. Study, prepare yourself, give your son a better future." In 1986, when my son Bobby was 4 years old and had started kindergarten, I began studying for my high school diploma at the Benito Juarez Night School. It was a 3-year program, from Monday to Friday, 7 to 10 at night. My mom helped me by taking care of the boy, and I would get home at 10:30. I'd have a quick dinner and then stay up very late studying math, history, literature, and all the subjects I needed to graduate. Those were very hard but very satisfying years. During the day, I worked in the school kitchen. In the afternoons, I took care of my son and helped him with his homework. At night, I studied, and in my free time, I did my high school homework. I slept very few hours, but I had a clear goal: to give my son the example that a woman can get ahead on her own and to prepare myself for better job opportunities. In May of 1989, at the age of 33, I graduated from high school. It was one of the proudest days of my life. My son Bobby, who was almost 7, was in the front row of the auditorium with my parents, my siblings, and even Miss Gloria. When they handed me my diploma, Bobby shouted, "That's my mom!" and the whole audience laughed and applauded. That night, we celebrated with a dinner at my parents' house, and my mom made my favorite 3-layer cake. With my high school diploma, I was able to get a better job. In September of 1989, I was hired as a secretary in the municipal government offices. The salary was $850 a month, almost double what I earned at the school, and I had better benefits. I worked from 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, which allowed me to be with my son when he got out of school. During all these years, from 1985 to 1990, there were several occasions when good, hard-working men were interested in me. Mr. Green, a widowed accountant who had a son my son's age, invited me out several times. Professor Richards from the night school, a very cultured and kind man, also courted me for several months. Even the eldest son of Mrs. Davis, my neighbor, who had returned from studying in the capital, asked my dad for permission to visit me, but I wasn't ready to trust a man again. The pain of abandonment was still too fresh, the feeling of having been deceived, the difficulty of raising a child alone. Besides, I had discovered that I was capable of getting ahead on my own, and I really liked that independence. I'd rather be alone than in bad company. I would tell my friends when they asked why I didn't give any suitor a chance. My son Bobby grew up to be a very responsible and affectionate boy. Since he never really knew his father, he never asked much about him. I would tell him that his dad had to go work far away and hadn't been able to come back, but that he loved him very much. Bobby accepted that explanation and focused on his studies and helping me around the house. He was a very intelligent and studious boy. He always got good grades, was respectful to his teachers, and never gave me any serious trouble. The teachers always congratulated me on how well behaved he was, and I felt very proud to have raised such a good son practically on my own. My dad became the father figure Bobby needed, and the two of them developed a very beautiful relationship. In 1992, when Bobby was 10, I decided to do something I had been considering for a long time: buy my own house. With my savings from my government job, and with the help of an FHA loan, I bought a small house in the model colony neighborhood, not far from where I had lived my first years of marriage. It was a small but nice house: 2 bedrooms, living room, dining room, kitchen, and a backyard where I could plant flowers and medicinal herbs. Moving into our own home was like definitively closing the chapter of my marriage with Robert. I was no longer the abandoned woman who had returned to live with her parents. Now I was an independent woman with her own house, a stable job, a wonderful son, and plans for the future. I had learned to be happy without depending on anyone else. The 90s were very good for us. Bobby continued to be an excellent student, and when he finished middle school in 1995, he got a scholarship to study at the community college's high school program. I was still working at the municipal government. I had been promoted to administrative assistant with a better salary. In my free time, I took courses in computing and basic English to better prepare myself. In 1998, when Bobby turned 16, I finally dared to accept the invitations of a very special man. His name was Arthur Williams. He was an agricultural engineer, divorced, with 2 daughters who were already adults. Arthur was very different from Robert Miller. He was a mature, responsible man who had raised his daughters alone after his divorce, and who perfectly understood the responsibilities of being a father. Arthur and I met at a work training. He worked for the Department of Agriculture, and for several months we coincided in different meetings and courses. He was a very respectful, very cultured man who treated me like a lady. He never pressured me for anything. He always respected that my priority was my son, and slowly we developed a very beautiful friendship that turned into love. In the year 2000, when my son Bobby was about to enter college, he had gotten a scholarship to study industrial engineering. Arthur asked me to marry him. It was a very romantic, but very practical proposal. "Mary," he said, "we've known each other for 2 years now. I love you, and I respect your independence. I don't want you to change your life for me. I want us to combine our lives to be happier together." We got married in a simple but very beautiful ceremony in April of 2000. I was 44 years old. Arthur was 45. Bobby was now an 18-year-old young man who was very happy to see his mother happy. Arthur's daughters, who were already 22 and 25, welcomed me with great affection. We formed a very close and very functional family. The years with Arthur were the most stable and happiest of my adult life. He was the perfect partner, hardworking, responsible, affectionate, who respected my independence and my opinions. He never tried to change or control me. On the contrary, he always supported me in my plans and my dreams. When I wanted to study for a technical degree in administration, he encouraged me and helped me with the expenses. When I decided to open a small home-cooked meal business, he helped me with the permits and the paperwork. For 15 years, from 2000 to 2015, I lived the life I had always dreamed of having. I had a stable and happy marriage, a successful son who had graduated as an engineer and had a good job. My precious grandchildren Bobby got married in 2008 and had 2 beautiful children in my own home cooking business, which gave me financial independence and a lot of personal satisfaction. In 2015, Arthur fell ill with diabetes and heart problems. For 2 years, I cared for him with all my love, but the illness was stronger. Arthur died in March of 2017 at the age of 62. It was a great pain, but very different from the pain I had felt when Robert abandoned me. This time, I had had the opportunity to say goodbye, to tell him how much I loved him, to accompany him until the end. It was a clean pain, without grudges or unanswered questions. After Arthur's death, I decided to move on with my life. I was 62 years old, in good health with my cooking business, my grandchildren who filled me with joy, and many plans still to realize. I dedicated myself to traveling a bit, something I had never done when I was young, to spending time with my grandchildren, and to enjoying my independence as a mature woman. During all these years, from 1985 to 2024, I never heard anything from Robert Anthony Miller again. I never received a letter. No one ever told me they had seen him. I never had any news of him. In my mind and in my heart, Robert had died many years ago. He had been an important part of my past, the father of my son, my first love, but he was no longer part of my present or my future. That's why, my dears, you can imagine the shock I got that afternoon in December of 2024, when I heard someone knocking insistently on my door. When I opened it and saw an old man standing there with white hair, wrinkled, but with those same brown eyes that I had loved so much in my youth. "Hello, Mary," he said with a voice I recognized immediately despite the years. "It's Robert. I've come back for you." My dears, there are no words to describe what I felt at that moment. It was as if I had seen a ghost, as if the past had returned to reclaim me after almost half a century. I stood paralyzed in the doorway, unable to speak, unable to move, trying to process what my eyes were seeing. Robert was standing there on my doorstep, but it was a completely different Robert from the one I had known. He was no longer the 26-year-old young man who had left with an old suitcase and many promises. This was a 69-year-old man with completely white hair, his skin very wrinkled by the sun, thinner than before, but it was definitely him. He had the same brown eyes, the same way of tilting his head a little when he spoke, the same large, hard-working hands. "Can I come in?" he asked after a silence that felt eternal. "We need to talk, Mary." His voice was hoarse, more tired, but it was the same voice that had told me, "I love you," so many times in our youth. I still couldn't react. My mind couldn't process what was happening. You're dead," I finally said, as if I were talking to a spirit. "You were declared dead almost 40 years ago. What? What are you doing here?" Robert looked down and said, "I know you have a lot of questions, my love. I also have a lot of things to explain. Can we sit down and talk? I've come a long way to see you." I don't know why I let him in. Maybe it was the shock. Maybe because after so many years, I needed answers. Maybe because a part of me, deep down, had always wanted to see him again. I led him to the living room and offered him coffee, more out of habit than courtesy. My hands trembled as I prepared the coffee, and my mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. When I returned to the living room with the coffee cups, Robert was looking at the photographs I have on the shelf. Photos of my son Bobby graduating as an engineer. Photos of my grandchildren. Photos of my wedding with Arthur. Photos of our trips. "I see you've had a good life," he said with a sad smile. "I'm very happy to know that." "A good life?" I asked, and for the first time I felt the surprise turn into anger. "Robert, you abandoned me 41 years ago. You left me alone with a 1-year-old baby. I had to completely rebuild my life from scratch. And now you come here as if nothing happened to tell me you're glad I had a good life?" Robert got very serious and said, "You're right to be angry with me, Mary. You have every right to hate me. But let me explain what happened. Please, let me tell you why I couldn't come back sooner." And then he began to tell me a story I could have never imagined. A story that explained the 41 years of silence, but at the same time filled me with more questions and more pain. "When I got to Jacksonville in late 1983, he said, "everything was very different from what I had been." A story of shame and failure. It sounds plausible, doesn't it? A young man overwhelmed by life. But even as Robert spoke, Mary must have felt 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. Is this the whole truth, or just the tip of the iceberg? Let's join Mary in finding the answer. Told. The work at the factory was very hard, and they paid very little. I lived in a room with 5 other men, all sleeping in bunk beds, sharing a dirty bathroom, eating nothing but canned soup and beans. It was a very hard life, but I put up with it because I thought of you and our son. After a few months, I met some men who told me that on the other side, in another state, you could earn much more money. They told me that for $500 they could get me there, that I would earn in a week what I earned in a month in Florida, that in 2 years I would have enough money to come back for you and buy a nice house here in San Marcos. Robert told me that in September of 1984, he had decided to try to get involved with a smuggler. I paid the $500 I had saved working at the factory, and one night they took us out to sea with 20 other men, but something went wrong. The Coast Guard caught us when we had only been on the water for a few hours. They deported all of us immediately. But the problem, Robert continued, was that the smuggler told me that since they had caught us, it was my fault, that I had made noise, and that's why they discovered us. He said I had to pay him another $500 for the costs of the operation. I didn't have that money, and when I told him I couldn't pay, he threatened me. He said that if I didn't pay him within a week, something very serious would happen to me. According to Robert, that was the reason he had disappeared from Jacksonville so suddenly. I had to leave Jacksonville that same night, Mary. Those men weren't playing around. I knew of cases of people who had been beaten or even killed for not paying the smugglers. I grabbed my few things and left on the first bus out of the station. "And why didn't you write to me to tell me that?" I asked. "Why didn't you come back to San Marcos to me?" Robert lowered his head and said, "Because I was so ashamed, Mary. I had failed completely. I had no money, no job, and I was afraid those men would look for me. I felt like a coward who had abandoned his family and failed at everything." Robert told me that since September of 1984, he had been wandering through different cities in the South, working whatever jobs he could find, on farms, in construction, in markets, always with temporary and low-paying jobs. "I lived like a man with no past and no future," he said. "I slept wherever I could, ate once a day if I was lucky, and I was always hiding because I was afraid the men from Jacksonville would find me. All these years, I thought about you and our son every day," he continued, "but the more time passed, the harder it became to return. How was I going to explain that I had been alive all this time, but hadn't had the courage to come back? How was I going to justify years and years of abandonment? I thought it was better for you to believe I was dead, for you to rebuild your life, for you to be happy without—" You listen to that. Now, does that sound like a real father? No matter how much shame or failure a man feels, the love for his child should drive him to find a way. An anonymous letter, a little money sent through a friend. There are 1,000 ways to show you exist without showing your face. A silence that wasn't shame. That was an emptiness, a frightening kind of carelessness. Robert told me that in 1995, 12 years after he had left, he had secretly returned to San Marcos to see us from a distance. "I found out that you had married an engineer, that you had a new life, that our son was studying at the university. Seeing you so happy confirmed that I had made the right decision not to return. You were better off without me." "You were here, and you didn't approach us?" I asked, outraged. "Robert, do you know the pain you caused me? Do you know how much I suffered thinking you were dead? Do you know what it was like to raise our son alone? To explain to him why his father wasn't there? To put up with people's gossip?" At that moment, I started to cry, but not from sadness, but from rage. "I know," Robert said with tears in his eyes. "I know, and it has tormented me all these years. But at that moment, I thought it was for the best. You had a stable life, a new family, a future. I had nothing to offer you but problems and pain." Robert told me that after seeing us in 1995, he had continued to live in different cities in the South, always alone, always working in temporary jobs. In 2010, he had settled in Mobile, Alabama, where he had gotten a job as a night watchman at a transportation company. "For the first time in many years, I had a stable job and a fixed place to live," he said. "But I was still a lonely man, without family, without real friends, living with the weight of what I had done." In 2020, when I was 65, I got sick with diabetes, he continued. The doctors told me I had to take good care of myself, take my medicine, not be alone in case something happened to me. It was then that I started to think that maybe it was time to come back, to ask for forgiveness, to try to fix things before I died. But I was very scared, Robert admitted. What if you didn't live here anymore? What if you rejected me? What if your new family didn't want me around? For 4 years, I was gathering the courage to come look for you. Until 2 months ago, when they told me I have heart problems in addition to diabetes, I decided I had to try. I didn't want to die without asking for your forgiveness, without explaining what had happened, without trying to fix things between us. When Robert finished telling his story, we were silent for several minutes. I had so many mixed emotions that I didn't know what to say. On one hand, I understood a little better what had happened, but on the other hand, I was furious that he had made decisions about our lives without consulting us, that he had left us suffering while he knew we were okay. Robert, I finally said, I understand you had problems. I understand you were afraid to come back, but we were your family. You had an obligation to fight for us, to trust us, to give us the opportunity to decide together what to do. You decided for us that it was better for you not to exist in our lives, but that was not your decision to make. I know, he said. I know, and I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know the truth. I just wanted to apologize before I die, and I wanted to meet my son. If he wants to meet me, I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I would really like to be able to talk to him, to explain that his father didn't abandon them because he didn't love them, but because he was a coward who didn't know how to do things right. At that moment, I realized that Robert truly believed he had done the right thing, that he had made the least bad decision in a very difficult situation. But I also realized that his return was not a gift for me, but a very big problem, because after 41 years of having rebuilt my life without him, I now had to decide what to do with this ghost from the past who had returned to claim a place that no longer existed. Robert sat in my living room waiting for my answer while I processed the most shocking information of my life. Oh, my dears, you have to understand my position then. The young Mary inside me wanted to run up, hug him, and cry, but this old Mary was screaming, "Be careful." After all those years of life, I had learned one thing. When a story sounds too much like a movie, it's very likely not true. The truth is usually less dramatic and much more painful in life, and it was at that moment that I had to make the most difficult decision of my 69 years. What was I going to do with this man who had been my husband, who had abandoned our son, who had remained silent for 4 decades, and who now returned, asking for forgiveness and wanting to reclaim a family that no longer existed? After hearing Robert's whole story, I told him I needed time to process everything he had told me. You can't just show up after 41 years and expect us to make such an important decision in one afternoon, I explained. This affects many people, me, our son, my grandchildren, the whole family we've built all these years without you. Robert said he understood perfectly. I'm in no hurry, Mary. I've waited 41 years for this conversation. I can wait as long as necessary. I asked him where he was staying, and he told me he had rented a room in a boarding house near the city center. I told him I would give him my phone number so we could stay in touch while I decided what to do. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I tossed and turned in bed, thinking about everything Robert had told me, trying to understand how I really felt about his return. On one hand, there was a part of me that felt relief knowing he hadn't died, that he had been alive all these years. But on the other hand, I was furious that he had chosen to stay away when he could have returned at any time. The next day, I called my son Bobby to tell him what had happened. Can you imagine the shock he got? My dad is alive? He asked incredulously. And he's been alive all these years without looking for us? I told him the whole story his father had told me, and Bobby was quiet for a very long time. Mom, he finally said. I grew up without a father. Grandpa Henry was my father figure. And then Arthur was like a dad to me. This man may be my biological father, but he is not my dad. My dad would have been here when I needed him, when I was in school, when I graduated, when I got married, when my children were born. A father doesn't abandon his family and then come back 40 years later as if nothing happened. My son's words hurt me deeply, but they also helped me see things more clearly. Robert Sr. had lost his chance to be a father when he decided not to return. He could no longer claim that place because someone else had filled it and because you can't get back the years. Bobby's words were like a splash of cold water, yet so necessary. A father's love can't be replaced by an apology after 4 decades. This very moment lit the first flame of doubt in Mary's heart. Where will this doubt lead her? Let's follow along and see. For the next 2 weeks, Robert called me every day. He told me where he had worked all those years. He showed me old photographs he had kept of us. He talked about how he had continued to love me despite the distance and time. It was clear he hoped we could pick up our relationship where we had left off, as if 41 years were just a long parenthesis. But I was no longer the 25-year-old girl who had waited for her husband. I was a 69-year-old woman who had lived a full life without him. I had raised our son alone. I had finished my education, had a professional career, had a very happy marriage with Arthur, had become a grandmother, had traveled, had my own businesses. I was a completely different person, with experiences that Robert didn't know and hadn't shared. Besides, there was something about Robert's story that didn't completely convince me. If he had really been in the country all these years working normal jobs, why had he never tried to contact us indirectly? Why had he never sent money anonymously? Why had he never asked about us through an acquaintance? His explanation of fear and shame seemed insufficient to justify 4 decades of total silence. One day, I decided to do something Robert didn't expect. I told him I wanted us to go to the county clerk's office together to officially verify his identity. If you really are Robert Anthony Miller, my legally deceased husband, I said, we need the authorities to confirm your identity and cancel the declaration of death certificate. Robert got very nervous with that proposal. Why do we need to do that? He asked. I know who I am. You know who I am. Isn't that enough? That reaction made me even more suspicious. A man who had truly been lost for 41 years would be anxious to reclaim his legal identity. A woman's intuition, especially one who has lived for nearly 70 years, is rarely wrong. This man's nervous reaction was the first red flag Mary couldn't ignore. From this point on, the story is no longer about feelings, but a search for the truth. Let's see what Mary will do with this growing suspicion, not nervous about verifying it. I insisted that we go to the clerk's office, and finally, Robert agreed. When we arrived at the offices, the clerk who assisted us, Mr. Peters, asked us to present identification documents. Robert pulled out a very old and battered voter registration card and a document that he claimed was his birth certificate. The clerk reviewed the papers for a very long time, compared them with the records he had on his computer, and then asked us to wait a few minutes. When he returned, Mr. Peters had a very serious expression. Mrs. Miller, he said, there are some inconsistencies in these documents that we need to clarify. Could you please return tomorrow with more identification documents? I need to do some additional verifications. Robert became even more nervous and told me he had things to do, that it was better if we came back another day. That night, Robert called me and said he had decided to return to Mobile. I think my arrival is causing a lot of problems, he said. Maybe it's better if I go and leave you to live in peace. But I had already made a decision. Robert, I said, if you really are my husband, you're not leaving until we clear everything up legally. And if you're not my husband, I need to know who you are and why you're trying to deceive me. The next day, I returned to the county clerk's office alone and spoke with Mr. Peters. What he told me left me frozen. Mrs. Miller, he explained, the documents this man presented have several irregularities. The birth certificate number doesn't correspond with the official records, and the voter ID card has a hologram that doesn't match the era in which it was supposedly issued. Furthermore, I have consulted with my colleagues in Georgia, and there is no record of a Robert Anthony Miller born on the dates he mentions. What does that mean? I asked, although I already imagined the answer. It means it's very likely that this man is not who he says he is, the clerk replied. It's possible that he is someone who knew your husband at some point, who learned details of his life, and is now trying to pass himself off as him for some unknown reason. I left the clerk's office with a broken heart, but not from sadness but from rage. Someone had been playing with my feelings. Someone had been taking advantage of my pain and my story for some purpose I did. Rage replaces pain. Can you imagine? The pain of losing a husband, the pain of being abandoned, all now transformed into fury upon learning she had been so cruelly deceived. But what will an angry Mary do next? Let's discover the next chapter of this dramatic story and understand. I went back to my house, picked up the phone, and called Robert. "We need to talk immediately," I said. "Come to my house right now." An hour later, Robert arrived at my door, and this time I was prepared for the most important conversation of my life. What happened next confirmed to me that at 69, a woman can still be surprised by what she is capable of when she is deceived. When Robert entered my house that afternoon, I already had everything planned. During the hour I had spent waiting for him, I had prepared everything I needed to unmask this impostor who had been playing with my feelings and my family's history. On the living room table, I had placed all the original letters the real Robert had sent me from Jacksonville, photographs of our wedding and our first years of marriage, and a document I had obtained that very morning from the county clerk's office. "Sit down, Robert," I said in a very calm but very firm voice. "We have several very important things to talk about." He sat on the sofa where he had been 2 weeks before, but this time I noticed he was very nervous. He was constantly wringing his hands, sweating even though it wasn't hot, and avoiding looking me directly in the eyes. "Before we start our conversation," I said, "I want you to see this." I showed him the document I had gotten from the county clerk's office. It was a copy of the real Robert Anthony Miller's birth certificate with all the official data the authorities had found in the Georgia archives. "This is my husband's real birth certificate," I explained. "As you can see, there are several important differences from the documents you presented to me." Robert's face changed completely. The expression of nervousness turned to panic, and then to resignation. He was silent for several minutes, looking at the document, and then he looked up at me with an expression I no longer recognized at all. "Who are you?" I asked directly. "What's your real name? And why are you here pretending to be my dead husband?" The man who had been calling himself Robert stood up, walked to the window, and then turned to me with a completely different expression. He no longer had the humble, repentant posture of the husband returning to beg for forgiveness. Now he had the posture of a man who had been caught in a very elaborate lie. "My real name is Walter Sanders," he finally said. "And you're right, I'm not your husband." When I heard that name, I immediately realized where I had heard it before. It was the same name as the man who had supposedly written to me from Jacksonville in 1984, saying that Robert had hurt his hand and couldn't write. "You wrote that letter in 1984. I said, "You were the one who sent me that fake letter saying Robert was injured." Walter lowered his head and said, "Yes, I wrote that letter." And then he told me a completely different story. A story that explained everything that had really happened, but that was much more painful than anything I could have imagined. Walter told me that he had met the real Robert in Jacksonville in 1984, that they had worked together in the same factory and had been roommates for several months. "Robert talked a lot about you and his son," he said. "He would show me the pictures he carried in his wallet. He would tell me about San Marcos, about his family, about how much he missed you all and how much he wanted to come back to you." "What happened to the real Robert?" I asked, although I already imagined the answer would be terrible. Walter looked at me with very sad eyes and said, "Robert died in September of 1984, Mary. He died at sea, trying to get..." The truth is finally revealed, more painful and brutal than anything Mary could have imagined. Her husband wasn't a betrayer, he was a victim. But this pain cannot excuse Walter's actions. Will Mary accept this explanation? Or will she see through the true nature of the man standing before her? Let's hear how she decides. To another country. According to Walter, Robert had decided to try to cross the border with a smuggler to earn money faster and be able to return for us soon. The night before he left, he gave me all your pictures and asked me that if anything happened to him, I should write you a letter so you wouldn't be left waiting for him forever. But when he was killed at sea, I didn't have the courage to write you the truth. Instead, I wrote you that letter saying he was injured, thinking they would find a way to tell you the truth later. He was killed? I asked, horrified. Who killed him and why? Walter told me that the group Robert had tried to cross with had been attacked by criminals in the middle of the ocean. They were other criminals who specialized in robbing migrants. They killed Robert and 2 other men and took all the money and belongings they had. The bodies were never found because they were left in a very remote part of the ocean. All these years, I've carried the weight of not having told you the truth, Walter continued. I've thought about you and your son constantly, wondering how you were, if you had rebuilt your lives, if you were still waiting for Robert. When I got sick a few months ago and the doctors told me I don't have much time left, I decided I had to come and tell you the truth before I die. But why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? I asked. Why did you invent that whole story about being Robert and being alive all these years? Walter explained that when he arrived in San Marcos and saw me, he realized I was exactly as Robert had described me, a good, hard-working woman who had raised her son alone and had gotten ahead despite everything. When I saw you, Mary, I realized why Robert loved you so much. And when I saw that you had had a good life, that you had been happy, I thought maybe it would be better not to tell you that he had died in such a terrible way. I thought it was better to invent a story where Robert had lived but had his reasons for not returning than to tell you he had been murdered at sea. But that was not your decision to make, I said with a voice I didn't recognize myself, a voice full of an authority I didn't know I had. You had no right to decide for me what was better for me to know and what wasn't. You had no right to play with my life, with my feelings, with the memory of my dead husband. At that moment, my dears, I felt something I had never felt in my 69 years of life. It was a mixture of rage, of pain, but above all, of a steely determination. This man had come to my house. He had opened wounds that had healed decades ago. He had lied about my husband's death, had played with my emotions, and on top of that, he believed he had done something good for me. Walter kept talking, trying to justify what he had done. Mary, I never wanted to hurt you. On the contrary, I wanted to protect you from the pain of knowing how Robert had died. I really thought it was better for you to believe he had a life, even if it was far from you, than to know he had died so young and in such a violent way. Protect me? I asked, and my voice sounded so cold that even I was surprised. Protect me by coming to my house 40 years later to impersonate my dead husband? Protect me by making me believe that the man I loved had been alive all these years and had decided not to return to us? Protect me by making me relive all the pain of abandonment when I had already made peace with his death? Walter fell silent because he had no answer for that. I stood up from the sofa and walked to the window. I needed air. I needed to think. For a few minutes, only silence could be heard in the living room, occasionally interrupted by the sound of cars passing on the street. I want you to leave my house, I finally said without turning to look at him. I want you to leave my house, and I never want to see you again. I heard Walter get up from the sofa. I heard his footsteps approaching where I was. Mary, please, he said. I know I did wrong. I know I shouldn't have lied to you, but all I wanted was... I don't care what you wanted, I shouted, turning to face him. I don't care about your intentions. What matters is what you did. And what you did was steal the peace I had found after years of suffering. Walter left my house that afternoon, but I knew this wasn't over. I couldn't just let him go and pretend nothing had happened. This man had played with the memory of my dead husband. He had lied about the circumstances of his death. He had manipulated my feelings using intimate information about my life, and he had disturbed my family's peace. That night I couldn't sleep, but not because of sadness, but because of a strange energy I had never felt before. It was as if after 69 years of being a woman who had always reacted to situations, Robert's abandonment, the need to work and study, Arthur's death for the first time in my life, I was going to be the one to take complete control of a situation. The next day, I began to plan exactly what I was going to do with Walter Sanders. All my life, I had been a reactive woman who responded to problems as they came, who adapted to circumstances others created. But this time was going to be different. This time, I was going to be the one to decide how things were going to be. This is the moment Mary Elizabeth Walker transforms. She is no longer a victim of circumstance. Now, she is the architect, the hunter. It's incredible to see a 69-year-old woman turn her pain into a perfect plan for retribution. What is that plan, and will it succeed? Don't look away from the story now. B. The first thing I did was call my son Bobby and tell him the whole truth about what I had discovered. My son was furious. "Mom, that man is a con artist, a manipulator. We have to report him to the police immediately." But I told him to wait, that I had a better plan than simply turning him over to the authorities. I explained. I said, if we report him to the police, they'll process him for fraud or identity theft. They'll give him a few years in jail, and then he'll get out free to continue with his life as if nothing happened. But I want more than that. I want him to truly understand the damage he caused, to feel firsthand what it means for someone to play with your life and your feelings. Over the next 3 days, I developed a very careful plan. First, I investigated everything I could about Walter Sanders. I went to the boarding house where he was staying and spoke with the owner, Mrs. Ruth, an elderly lady who had known my family for years. "Oh, Mary," said Mrs. Ruth, "I'm so glad you came to ask about that man. I had a bad feeling about him from the moment he arrived. He's always talking on the phone in a low voice, like he's hiding, and he has some letters and papers that he keeps locked in a suitcase. Besides, a young man came looking for him last night, and they were talking in the yard until very late." That information confirmed that Walter was not acting alone. He probably had accomplices. This was likely part of a larger scheme to defraud widows or families who had lost someone. That gave me even more determination to execute my plan. The second step was to get help from people I trusted and who understood the seriousness of the situation. I spoke with my brother Scott, who worked in the district attorney's office, and explained everything that had happened. He assured me that what Walter had done constituted several crimes: fraud, identity theft, and possibly emotional extortion. "But, sis," Scott said, "for the charges to be solid, we need clear evidence of his fraudulent intentions. We need him to admit what he's doing and why he's doing it." That fit perfectly with what I had been planning. I also spoke with Mr. Framina Peters from the county clerk's office, who explained that cases like this were more common than people thought. There are organized groups that dedicate themselves to investigating the history of families who have lost someone and then send someone to impersonate that person to scam money or get personal information for other frauds. Mr. Peters helped me get all the official documentation about Robert's declaration of death and explained the legal process we would have to follow for Walter to face the consequences of his actions. But he also warned me that if Walter was part of a larger organization, simply arresting him would not completely solve the problem. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "if we really want to dismantle these types of scams, we need to get information on how they operate, who else is involved, what other families they have affected. And to get that information, we need him to believe his plan is working." That gave me the perfect idea for the most important part of my plan. Instead of just confronting Walter and turning him over to the authorities, I was going to make him believe that he had fallen for his lie, that I was willing to help him with what he really wanted, and then I was going to use that information to make sure that he and his accomplices faced the full consequences of their actions. The third step was to prepare the perfect setting for the final encounter. I decided that the ideal place would be my own home, where I had full control of the situation, where I had all the evidence organized, and where I could record everything that happened without Walter realizing it. My grandson, Alex, who studies computer systems, helped me install a very discreet audio and video recording system in my living room. We placed small hidden cameras behind the picture frames and miniature microphones under the coffee table. "Grandma," Alex said, "this is like a spy movie. Are you sure you want to do this?" "Very sure, sweetie," I replied. "That man played with your grandmother's deepest feelings. And now he's going to learn that a 69-year-old woman is not an easy victim." My grandson looked at me with an admiration I had never seen in his eyes. "Grandma, I've never seen you so determined. That man doesn't know who he's messed with." I also prepared all the documents I would need. Copies of the fake letters Walter had sent in 1984, copies of Robert's presumptive death certificate, photographs of my family that might tempt him to ask for money or information, and a fake document I had prepared with the help of Miss Peters, stating that I had inherited a significant amount of money from Arthur's life insurance. The fourth step was the most important psychological preparation. All my life, I had been a woman who avoided conflict, who tried to keep the peace, who preferred to suffer in silence rather than confront someone. But this situation required me to be a completely different person. Calculating, firm, capable of manipulating someone who had tried to manipulate me. I practiced different ways of speaking, different facial expressions, different body postures in front of the mirror. I had to convince Walter that I was willing to believe his lie, that I was emotionally vulnerable, that I was exactly the type of easy victim he expected to find. I also mentally prepared for all the possible reactions Walter might have when he discovered that I knew the truth from the beginning. I had to be ready for anything, for him to try to leave, to become aggressive, to try to manipulate me with more lies, or to simply break down and confess everything. The fifth step was to get reliable witnesses who could witness everything that was going to happen. I decided that my brother Scott and Mr. Peters would be hidden in my kitchen, from where they could hear the entire conversation and intervene if something went wrong. I also coordinated with my son Bobby to be waiting outside the house, ready to call the police if necessary. "Mom," Bobby said, "I still don't understand why we don't just call the police now and get it over with. Why make it so complicated?" I explained that I wanted to be absolutely sure I had all the possible information before Walter was arrested. "Son, if we just arrest him now, he can deny everything. He can say he really believed he was your dad. He can invent some story to reduce his sentence. But if we can get him to confess his true intentions, if we get information about his accomplices, if we prove that this was a premeditated fraud, then we can make sure he receives the full punishment he deserves." The sixth step was to establish contact with Walter for the final meeting. I sent him a message through Mrs. Ruth, telling him that I had been thinking a lot about everything he had told me, that I had spoken with my son, and that we would like to talk with him again. I told him that we had decided we wanted to help him, that we understood why he had done what he did, and that we hoped we could find a way to be a family again. When Mrs. Ruth reported Walter's reaction to the message, I knew my plan was going to work. "Oh, Mary, that man was overjoyed when I gave him your message. His face lit up, and he told me he knew you were good people, that he knew you would understand his situation. He even asked me if your family had money, if your son had been successful in life." Those questions confirmed my suspicions that Walter had not come to my house just to confess the truth about Robert's death. He had come with specific intentions of getting something from us: money, personal information, or access to our family for some kind of long-term scam. The seventh and final step was to decide exactly what I was going to say to Walter when he came to my house, how I was going to make him confess his true intentions, and how I was going to reveal that I had known the truth from the beginning. I practiced the entire conversation with my brother Scott, who played the role of Walter so I could prepare all my responses. "Mary," Scott told me after one of our rehearsals, "I've never seen you like this. You seem like a professional actress or an experienced detective. Where did this cunning and calculating Mary come from?" I laughed and told him, "Scott, this Mary was always here. She just never had a strong enough reason to come out and defend what's hers." The night before the final meeting, I went to bed early but couldn't sleep. I wasn't nervous or worried. I was excited. For the first time in my life, I was going to be the one in complete control of an important situation. I was going to be the one with all the information, who managed the conversation, who decided how things would end. I thought about all the times in my life I had been a victim of other men's decisions. When Robert decided to leave without consulting me, when the real Robert decided to try to cross the border without telling me, when Walter decided to lie to me about his death, when this same Walter decided to come back into my life to play with my feelings. All those times, I had had to react, adapt, survive. But this time was going to be different. This time, I was going to be the one making the important decisions. I was going to be the one who decided what information to give and when to give it. I was going to be the one who controlled the pace of the conversation. I was going to be the one who decided when to end the game and reveal all the cards. The next morning, I got up early. I dressed very carefully, a navy blue dress that made me look respectable but vulnerable. I did my hair simply and prepared my house to receive Walter for the last time. I put the recorders in their places, checked that the witnesses were ready, organized all the documents I would need, and sat down to wait. When I heard the knock on the door at 3 o'clock sharp, I took a deep breath and said to myself, "Mary, it's time for a 69-year-old woman to teach this man what happens when you mess with the wrong family." When I opened the door, Walter was standing there with a huge smile and a bouquet of red carnations in his hands. He was wearing new clothes, gray dress pants, and a white shirt, well ironed, and he had even gotten a haircut. It was clear he had invested money to look good for this visit, which confirmed to me that he definitely expected to get something important from our meeting. "Mary, my love," he said in that voice I now knew was completely fake. "You don't know how happy it made me to get your message. I knew you would understand. I knew we would find a way to be together again." He gave me the carnations and tried to kiss my cheek, but I pulled back slightly. "Come in, Robert," I said, using the fake name on purpose. "We have a lot to talk about." I led him to the living room, offered him coffee, and sat in the same spot where I had been 2 weeks before, when he had first told me his fabricated story. But this time, everything was different. This time, I had absolute control of the situation. "Robert," I said, once we were seated with our coffee cups, "I've been thinking a lot about everything you told me. My son and I have talked for long hours about your return, about what it means for our family, about how we can move forward." Walter leaned forward, obviously anxious to hear what I was going to say. "At first I was very confused, very hurt," I continued. "But then I realized you're right. We did have a good life without you, and that wouldn't have been possible if we had known you died in such a terrible way. It was better to believe you had decided to start a new life, even if it hurt us." Walter's face lit up completely. "Oh, my love, I knew you would understand. I knew you would realize that everything I did was for love, to protect you." He took my hand in his, and I had to make a huge effort not to pull it away immediately. His hands were sweaty and cold, very different from the hard-working, warm hands I remembered of the real Robert. "But now that you're back," I said, "we need to talk about practical things. It's been 41 years, Robert. I completely rebuilt my life. I have my properties, my savings, my business. How are we going to organize all this now that you're back?" It was exactly the question I had planned to ask him, the perfect bait for him to reveal his true intent. What a clever move. Mary isn't just setting a trap, she's playing a masterful game of psychological chess. Every word, every gesture is carefully calculated to lead the prey into her snare. Walter has no idea that he is walking into an ending orchestrated by his own victim. Will he take the bait? Let's hold our breath and watch. Tensions. Walter let go of my hand and settled into the sofa with a more serious expression. "Well, my love, I've been thinking about the same thing. I have very little. Just my savings from all these years of working, which isn't much. But you, from what I can see, have been very successful. Your son is an engineer. You have this beautiful house. I imagine you must have a good estate accumulated." "Well, yes," I said, feigning a bit of embarrassment for showing off. "Arthur, my second husband, was very forward-thinking. He left me the house paid off, a considerable life insurance policy, and I have my savings from the cooking business. I'm not rich, but I'm comfortable." I took out the fake document I had prepared and showed it to him briefly. "Look, this is the bank statement where I have my main savings." Walter's eyes widened when he saw the fabricated figures on the document. I tried to put it away quickly, as if I hadn't meant for him to see it, but I made sure he got a good look at the numbers. "Sorry," I said, "I didn't mean to show off. It's just that Arthur always told me it was important to have organized documents." "No, my love, that's very good," Walter said, but his way of speaking had completely changed. His voice sounded more calculating, more interested. "It's very smart of you to have everything so well organized. And tell me, is your son also well off financially?" "Bobby is doing very well," I said. "He and his wife have a house in a very nice neighborhood. The children go to private schools, and he has a good position at an engineering firm. He even has plans to open his own company next year. All of that was true, but I exaggerated a bit to see how Walter would react. That's great, Walter said, but I could see his mind was working, calculating something. And tell me, would he be willing to help his father get established again here in San Marcos? Because I'm going to need to find a job, a place to live, new documents to sort out my legal situation. There it was. The first clear clue of what he really wanted. He hadn't come just to confess about Robert's death or to ask for my forgiveness. He had come with a specific plan to get money and help from us, taking advantage of our family feelings. Of course, I said. Bobby is still a little confused, but we've talked, and he's decided he wants to get to know you better, that he wants to help you get settled here. In fact, he's coming over in a little while so you can talk. Walter's face lit up again. But before he arrives, I continued, I want to ask you something important. During all these years, did you never have the temptation to write to us, to send us money, even anonymously, to ask someone how we were? It was a crucial question for my plan, because I needed him to explain why he had maintained absolute silence. Walter got a little nervous. Well, yes, my love. Many times I thought about it, but I was very afraid that you wouldn't want me anymore, that you had made a new life without me. And I was also afraid that if you knew I was alive, you would look for me, and that would put us all in danger. In danger of what? I asked, feigning concern. Are there still people who could harm you? That question was perfect, because it gave him the opportunity to invent more lies, or to reveal if he really had accomplices who could be dangerous. No, he said quickly. There's no danger anymore. Those people are either dead or have forgotten about me. That's why I was able to come back now. But for many years, I was afraid that if they looked for me, they would hurt you too. It was obviously a lie, but a useful lie for my purpose. Robert, I said, taking his hands again. There's something else I need to ask you. How did you know where to find me after so many years? How did you know I was still living in San Marcos? That I was still using my married name? That I hadn't moved to another city? That question made him very nervous. He was quiet for a very long moment, and I could see he was trying to invent a convincing answer. Well, by asking around, he said. I finally got to San Marcos and asked for the Walker family in the San Marcos neighborhood. Someone told me you had lived here after your second marriage. It was a very vague and unconvincing answer. If he had really been lost for 41 years, he would have been much more specific about how he had found me. That vagueness confirmed that he had had information about me before he arrived, probably from some prior investigation. And how did you know about my second marriage? I asked directly. How did you know I had married Arthur, that I was a widow, that I was living alone again? This time, Walter became visibly uncomfortable. He started to sweat and wring his hands nervously. Well, people told me, he said, but his voice sounded very unsure. When I asked about you, they told me you had been married to an engineer, but that you were now a widow. It was another very vague answer that didn't explain how he had obtained such specific information about my personal life. At that moment, I decided to increase the pressure a bit more. Robert, I said, I'm so glad you've returned, but I need to be sure of one thing. I need to be sure that you are really my Robert, that I'm not making a mistake. I took out one of the wedding photos I had prepared. Can you tell me what happened on the day of this photograph? What happened at our wedding that only you and I would know? Walter took the photograph and looked at it for a very long time. I could see his mind working desperately, trying to invent details that would sound convincing. Well, it was a very beautiful day, he said finally. We got married in St. Mark's Church. There were a lot of people. Your mom had prepared a lot of food. These were very general details that anyone could invent from looking at the photograph. But what happened specifically during the ceremony? I insisted. What did you whisper in my ear when we exchanged vows? What problem did we have with the ring? What happened when we were cutting the cake? Walter got even more nervous because he obviously didn't know any specific details from that day. Oh, my love, he said with a forced smile. So many years have passed that I don't remember all the little details, but I do remember how beautiful you looked. How happy I was to marry you. It was exactly the answer I expected. Vague, emotional, but without any specific detail that only the real Robert would have known. At that moment, the doorbell rang. "That must be my son," I told Walter. "Are you ready to meet Bobby after all these years?" Walter nodded enthusiastically, obviously excited for the opportunity to convince my son that he was his father as well. When I opened the door, it was indeed my son Bobby, but he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by Mr. Peters from the county clerk's office and my brother Scott. "Hi, Mom," Bobby said, with a smile I recognized immediately. It was the smile he made when he was about to give me a big surprise. "Robert," I said loudly, so Walter could hear from the living room. "I'm so glad you're here, and what a surprise that you brought Mr. Peters. Didn't I tell you we were going to be talking with your father?" My son winked at me and said, "Yes, Mom. That's precisely why we brought the clerk. We want to help resolve all of my dad's legal problems as soon as possible." When we entered the living room, Walter immediately stood up and extended his hand toward my son. "Bobby," he said with a voice full of feigned emotion. "My son, you don't know how long I've waited for this moment. You don't know how much I've thought about you all these years." My son shook his hand politely, but I could see in his eyes that he was making a huge effort to control his disgust. "Nice to meet you, Dad," my son said, pronouncing the word dad in a very strange way. "My mom has told me all about your return. It must have been very difficult for you to be away from us for so many years." Mr. Peters and my brother Scott sat in the remaining chairs, and I could see that Walter was a little nervous about the presence of so many people. "Well," said Mr. Peters in a very official voice, "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Miller has told us about your legal situation. We understand that you have been absent for many years and that you need to regularize your status. We have come to help you with all the necessary paperwork." Walter smiled broadly, obviously believing that everything was going according to his plan. "Thank you very much, sir," Walter said. "Yes, I need to sort out many things. Documents, identification, everything I need to be able to settle here again with my family." Mr. Peters took out a folder full of papers and placed it on the coffee table. "Perfect," said the clerk. "To begin the process, we need you to help us with some details about your life during these years of absence. For example, where exactly have you been living? Under what name have you been working? What identification documents have you been using?" Walter became visibly uncomfortable with these specific questions. "Well, I've been in several places," Walter said. "Mobile mainly, but also in other cities. I've worked under my own name, Robert Anthony Miller." Mr. Peters took notes carefully and then said, "Excellent. Then there should be no problem verifying your identity with the official records of those cities." It was at that moment that I decided it was time to end the game. Walter had revealed enough information about his intentions. He had clearly shown that he didn't know specific details about the real Robert's life and had fallen completely into the trap we had set for him. "Robert," I said, using his fake name for the last time, "before we proceed with all these legal formalities, there is something very important I need to tell you." I got up from my chair and walked to where I had all the documents I had prepared. "There's something you need to know about what we discovered when we went to the county clerk's office last week." Walter's face changed immediately. "What? What did you discover?" he asked in a voice that no longer sounded confident at all. I smiled and said, "We discovered exactly who you are, Walter Sanders. And we discovered exactly what happened to the real Robert Anthony Miller in September of 1984. The silence that followed my words was absolute. Walter stood completely still, his mouth open, looking at me as if he had seen a ghost. My son, Mr. Peters, and my brother Scott rose from their seats almost at the same time, ready for any reaction he might have. "How?" Walter murmured. "How did you know?" I approached him and said in a very calm but firm voice, "Walter, we have known the truth since the first day you came here. What you have just experienced for the last 2 hours has been exactly the same as what you made us experience. An elaborate lie, a manipulation of feelings, a cruel game with a family's emotions. And then I began to explain exactly what we were going to do with him and why a 69-year-old woman had turned out to be a much more dangerous opponent than he had ever imagined. The moment of justice. Every lie, every scheme, crumbles before the truth and wisdom of a wounded woman. Walter made a fatal mistake. He underestimated the strength of a grandmother. This is the climax of it all, but the story isn't over yet. What happens after the scammer is arrested? Let's listen to the final part to see how Mary truly found her peace. "Sit down, Walter," I said in a voice that brooked no argument. "Sit down and listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, because what you do in the next few minutes will determine how severe the consequences of your actions will be." Walter collapsed into the armchair as if his legs wouldn't support him. His face had lost all its color, and his hands were trembling visibly. "First," I continued, walking to the shelf where I had all my family photographs, "I want you to know that everything you have said and done here for the last 2 hours has been recorded on audio and video. We have complete evidence of your fraudulent intentions, your identity theft, and your attempt to scam money from my family." Walter looked around desperately, trying to locate the cameras and microphones, but my grandson had done an excellent job hiding them. "It's not possible," he muttered. "You couldn't have known." "Couldn't have known what?" I asked. "That we couldn't know that Robert died in 1984? That we couldn't know that you are Walter Sanders? That we couldn't know you came here with the intention of scamming us?" I showed him all the documents I had prepared, the reports from the clerk's office, the identity verifications, the investigation into his history. "Second," I continued, "I want you to know that we have investigated your real story, Walter. We know you're not from Mobile, as you said. We know you have a record for fraud in other states. We know this isn't the first time you've posed as a dead relative to scam money from widows." Mr. Peters stood up and placed a very thick file on the table. "Mr. Sanders," he said in an official voice, "we have reports here of at least 3 similar cases in Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana, where you or people working with you have used the exact same method. Investigating families who lost someone many years ago, showing up pretending to be that person, gaining the family's trust, and then scamming money or property." Walter turned even paler. No, he said in a barely audible voice. "This is a misunderstanding. I really knew Robert. I really wanted to help. But I cut him off immediately. Lies," I shouted with more force than I knew I was capable of. "Everything you have said since the first day has been a lie. The real Robert died in September of 1984, exactly as you said, but you weren't his friend. You were part of the group of criminals who murdered him." That accusation made Walter jump up from the armchair. "That's not true," he shouted. "I never killed anyone. I did know Robert. We did work together. He did ask me to write to you if anything happened to him. He was desperate, trying to salvage at least part of his story." My brother Scott approached him with a very serious expression. "Walter Sanders," he said, "I've worked in the district attorney's office for 20 years. I've seen many cases like this. We know exactly how these groups of scammers operate. They investigate old obituaries, records of missing persons, families who have reported deaths without bodies. Then they send someone to impersonate that person to get money, property, or personal information for other frauds. But in this case," Scott continued, "you made a very big mistake. You chose the wrong family. My sister Mary is not a vulnerable, lonely widow. She is an intelligent woman, with a close-knit family, with resources, and with contacts who can help her. And when you messed with her, you messed with all of us." Mr. Peters took another document from his folder. "Mr. Sanders, I have here an arrest warrant issued by a judge in Atlanta for the case of Mrs. Eleanor Goodman, a 72-year-old widow from whom you scammed $400,000 in 2019 by posing as her missing son. Mrs. Goodman died of a heart attack 2 weeks after discovering she had been scammed." When Walter heard that, he completely broke down. He fell back into the armchair and began to cry like a child. "I didn't want that to happen," he sobbed. "I never wanted anyone to die. I just needed money. I was sick. I didn't have a job." But I didn't feel a shred of compassion for him. "Walter," I said, approaching him until I was standing directly in front of him. "Do you have any idea of the damage you caused me? Do you have any idea what it meant for me to believe for 2 weeks that my husband had been alive all these years and had chosen not to return to us? Do you know what it means for a son to believe his father abandoned him by choice instead of having died?" I thought, Walter began to say, but I didn't let him finish. "You didn't think anything," I shouted. "You calculated, you planned, you came here specifically to hurt us to get money. And what's worse, you came to desecrate the memory of a man who was murdered. A man who cannot defend himself from your lies." My son Bobby came over and put his hand on my shoulder. "Mom," he said softly, "that's enough. We've got what we needed." He was right. We had managed to get Walter to confess his fraudulent intentions. We had obtained evidence of his methods and had confirmed that he was part of a larger operation. "Walter," said Mr. Peters, "in a few minutes, officers from the sheriff's department will arrive to arrest you. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney, and you have the right to one phone call. But you also have the opportunity to cooperate with the authorities to help us dismantle the entire network of scammers you are a part of. If you cooperate fully," the clerk continued, "if you give us the names of your accomplices, if you tell us how they get information about the families they target, if you help us locate other victims, that could be considered a mitigating circumstance in your legal process. But if you continue to lie, if you try to protect your accomplices, the sentence will be much more severe." Walter raised his head and looked at me with a pleading expression. "Mary," he said, "please, you are a good woman, a Christian woman. Have compassion on me. I am sick. I am an old man. I have no family. I have nothing. If they put me in jail, I will die in there." Those words filled me with a rage I didn't know I had inside me. "Compassion?" I asked incredulously. "You ask me for compassion after everything you've done? After scamming a 72-year-old woman who died of shock? After desecrating the memory of my dead husband? After playing with my family's feelings? Walter," I continued, "I am a Christian woman. You're right. And that's precisely why I understand that what you do is not just stealing money. You steal hope. You steal peace. You steal the dignity of families who have already suffered enough. You feed on the pain of widows and orphans, and that does not deserve compassion. That deserves justice." At that moment, there was a knock on the door. My brother Scott went to open it and returned accompanied by 2 sheriff's deputies. "Mr. Walter Sanders," said one of the deputies, "you are under arrest for the crimes of fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As the deputies read Walter his rights and handcuffed him, he kept looking at me with that pleading expression, but I kept my face completely serious. I was not going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me sad or regretful for what was happening. "Walter," I said as they were taking him away, "there's something else I want you to know. Mrs. Eleanor Goodman, the 72-year-old woman who died after you scammed her, had a granddaughter who is a lawyer. That granddaughter has been looking for you for 5 years to make you pay for what you did to her grandmother. She will be one of the main witnesses in your trial. And there's more," I continued. "We are going to make sure your case becomes public, that your photograph and your methods appear in the newspapers and on television so that other families know how to protect themselves from scammers like you. Your face will be known throughout the country as the face of someone who preys on the grief of families who have lost someone." When they took Walter away, my house fell silent for several minutes. My son, my brother, Mr. Peters, and I sat in the living room, processing everything that had happened. For the first time in 2 weeks, I felt completely at peace. "Mom," my son finally said, "I've never seen you like this. I've never seen you so powerful." I laughed and said, "Son, I didn't know that part of me either. But sometimes life puts you in situations where you discover what you're capable of when you really need to protect your family." Mr. Peters explained that the legal process would take several months, but that we had very solid evidence to ensure a conviction. He also told us that Walter would most likely cooperate with the authorities to reduce his sentence, which would help capture other members of his network. "Mrs. Miller," Mr. Peters said before leaving, What you did here was extraordinary. Your planning, your patience, your ability to manipulate someone who tried to manipulate you. Everything was perfect. I am sure that this case will serve to protect many other families." That night, when everyone had left and I was alone in my house, I sat in the same armchair where Walter had been that afternoon, lying and trying to scam us. I thought about everything that had happened over the last 3 weeks, from the moment he knocked on my door to the moment he was taken away under arrest. For the first time in my life, I had been the one who had completely controlled an important situation. I had been the one with all the information, who had managed the timing, who had decided how things would end. And not only had I protected my family, but I had helped protect other families in the future. I realized that for all these years, since Robert abandoned me in 1983, I had been reacting to situations that others created. But this time had been different. This time, it had been a 69-year-old woman taking control, planning strategically, and executing a perfect plan to bring about justice. And for the first time in many years, I felt completely proud of the woman I had. From an abandoned, grieving woman, Mary became a symbol of strength and justice. She not only reclaimed peace for her family, but also protected countless others. Her story is a powerful testament that it's never too late to stand up and fight for what's right. And now, in this final part, Mary will share the deepest lessons she has learned through this journey. This is precious advice that all of us should hear. The week after Walter's arrest was very intense. The local newspapers published the story with headlines like 69-year-old grandmother busts scammer ring and a Florida widow's perfect revenge. My photograph appeared on the front page of the San Marcos Sunday, and a television reporter even came to interview me. At first, I didn't want to talk to the media. I was embarrassed that everyone would find out about my private affairs, about Robert's story, about everything that had happened with Walter. But Mr. Peters convinced me that it was important to make the story public to warn other families about these types of scams. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "there are thousands of widows in America who could be victims of scammers like Walter. Your story can help protect them. Besides, the more publicity we give the case, the easier it will be for other victims to come forward and report." He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, the district attorney's office received more than 15 reports from families in different states who had been victims of similar scams. There were cases in Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and even Texas, where other scammers had used methods very similar to Walter's. Alabama. One of the most important calls was from Catherine Goodman, ESQ, the granddaughter of Mrs. Eleanor, who had died after being scammed by Walter. Miss Goodman came from Atlanta specifically to meet me and to thank me for having captured the man who had killed her grandmother. "Mrs. Miller," she said when we met, "you don't know what it means to me that this man will finally pay for what he did. My grandmother was a very good, hard-working woman who was widowed young and raised her children alone. The savings that man stole from her were to pay for my younger brother's college education. When my grandmother discovered she had been scammed," Miss Goodman continued, "she became so depressed that she stopped eating, stopped leaving her house, stopped talking to the family. In 2 weeks, she lost about 20 pounds, and then she had the heart attack that killed her. The doctors said it was due to the emotional stress of what had happened." Hearing that story confirmed that I had made the right decision. Walter was not just a common thief who stole money. He was a man who destroyed lives, who killed hopes, who murdered the dignity of elderly people who had already suffered enough in their lives. During the legal process, which lasted 6 months, Walter indeed decided to cooperate with the authorities. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he confessed to the entire operation he was a part of. It was a network of 8 people operating throughout the Southeast, led by a man from Atlanta who called himself the Lawyer. The operation worked like this. First, they would research old obituaries and reports of missing persons in newspapers from many years ago. Then, they would send someone to the cities where they had identified potential victims to investigate more details about the families. If they had been financially successful, if the widow was still alive, if they had prosperous children, if they lived alone or had relatives to protect them. Once they had all the necessary information, they would send someone like Walter to impersonate the deceased person and gain the family's trust. The goal was not just to steal money directly, but to gain access to bank accounts, properties, and personal information that they could later use for other frauds, and in some cases, even get the victims to bequeath their assets to them. According to Walter's confession, my case had been particularly attractive to them because they had investigated that my son was a successful engineer, that I owned my own home and business, and that I had also recently been widowed by a man who had a good life insurance policy. "We thought you would be easy victims," Walter confessed during his statement. But they had been completely mistaken. They hadn't counted on my family being very close-knit, on me having contacts in the government and the legal system, on my son being a very distrustful and intelligent person, and above all, they hadn't counted on the fact that at 69, I still had a lot of energy to fight against anyone who tried to hurt my family. Walter's trial took place in May of 2025. I was the main witness, and for 2 consecutive days, I had to tell the whole story, from the day Walter appeared at my door to the day we unmasked and arrested him. It was the first time in my life I had to speak in a courtroom, and at first, I was very nervous. But when I saw Walter sitting in the defendant's chair in his prison uniform, handcuffed and flanked by 2 guards, I remembered all the pain he had caused me and all the lies he had told me. That anger gave me the strength to speak clearly and firmly throughout Propen. My testimony. "Your Honor," I said when the judge gave me the opportunity to deliver my victim impact statement, "this man is not just a thief. He is someone who feeds on the pain of families who have lost someone. He is someone who destroys the peace of widows and orphans. He is someone who kills the hope of people who have already suffered enough. I was lucky enough to discover his lie before he stole money from me," I continued. "But other families have not been so lucky. Mrs. Eleanor Goodman died because of this man. How many other elderly women have suffered or will suffer if this man does not receive the punishment he deserves?" The judge gave Walter a sentence of 12 years in prison for aggravated fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. He also ordered him to pay damages of $500,000 to Mrs. Eleanor Goodman's family and $50,000 to my family for moral damages. When the judge read the sentence, Walter started to cry and looked at me with the same pleading expression he had on the day we arrested him. But this time, I kept my face completely serious. I had learned that misplaced compassion can be dangerous, that there are people who take advantage of the kindness of others to continue doing harm. After the trial, the other members of Walter's network were captured one by one. The lawyer turned out to be an accountant who had been disbarred for malpractice and had dedicated himself to organizing scams against the elderly. They all received sentences of between 8 and 15 years in prison. The case became so famous that they even wrote an article about me in a national magazine called Extraordinary Women. The article was titled, "Mary Walker, the grandmother who got revenge on a scammer," and told the whole story of how I had planned and executed Walter's capture. When I read that article, I couldn't help but laugh. I, who all my life had been a simple, hard-working woman who avoided problems and preferred to keep the peace, was now famous for being cunning, calculating, and vengeful. It was as if I had discovered a completely new personality within myself. My grandchildren were fascinated with the story. My grandson Alex, who had helped me with the recordings, bragged at his school that his grandmother had captured a gang of criminals. My granddaughter Sophia told me that when she grew up, she wanted to be like me, a grandmother who doesn't let anyone push her around. But the most important thing for me was not the fame or the recognition. The most important thing was that I had managed to get justice for Robert, for myself, for my family, and for all the people who had been victims of scammers like Walter. I had managed to turn my pain into action, my vulnerability into strength, my age into wisdom, and I had shown that a 69-year-old woman with life experience, a supportive family, and enough determination can be a very dangerous opponent for anyone who tries to take advantage of her. In the months following the trial, I received letters and calls from women all over the country who told me their own stories of scams, abuse, and situations where they had felt vulnerable and helpless. Many asked for my advice on how to handle their problems. Others simply wanted to thank me for showing that older women are not easy victims. One of the letters that moved me the most was from a woman in Monterey. She said my story gave her the courage to question a man claiming to be her long-lost brother. Thanks to my example, she discovered he was a scammer before he could take her life savings. Mrs. Miller, she wrote, thanks to your example, I was able to discover that this man was a scammer before he stole my life savings. You taught me that grandmothers can also be smart and strong when we need to protect what is ours. Those letters confirmed that everything that had happened had been worth it. I had not only protected my family, but I had helped protect many other families. My story had become a tool to educate and prevent, so that other women would know they didn't have to be passive victims of criminals who prey on their pain. Now, 6 months after Walter's arrest, my life has returned to normal, but I am a completely different person. I still have my cooking business, I still live in my house, I still enjoy my grandchildren, but I am no longer the same Mary I was before. Now I am a woman who knows she is capable of facing any situation, no matter how difficult. I am a woman who has shown that age and experience can be enormous advantages when used correctly. I am a woman who has learned that sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and that justice sometimes requires you to take matters into your own hands. And above all, I am a woman who has found final peace with Robert's death. Now I know exactly what happened to my first husband. I know he died trying to come back to me and our son. I know he didn't abandon us by choice. That certainty has allowed me to definitively close that chapter of my life and focus completely on the present and the future. My dears, now that you have heard my entire story, from the day I met Robert to the day I brought the man who desecrated his memory to justice, I want to share with you the most important lessons I have learned in my 69 years of life. The first lesson is that it is never, ever too late to defend yourself. For many years of my life, I believed that being a good woman meant putting up with everything, forgiving everything, avoiding conflict at all costs. But what happened with Walter taught me that sometimes being good means being strong. It means protecting your family. It means making criminals pay for their crimes. When Walter came to my door, I was 69 years old. Many people would have thought that a woman of that age can't do much against a professional scammer. But age gave me exactly the tools I needed. Experience to recognize when something wasn't right, patience to plan carefully, contacts to get help, and the wisdom to know that I didn't have to face this man alone. The second lesson is that criminals who prey on the elderly greatly underestimate their victims. Walter thought I would be a lonely and vulnerable widow, easy to manipulate with lies about my dead husband. He didn't count on me having a close-knit family, on me having learned to be independent and strong during 40 years of widowhood, on me having resources and contacts to investigate his story. Scammers like Walter look for victims who seem defenseless, but they make the mistake of confusing age with weakness, gentleness with naivety, loneliness with vulnerability. We, older women, have survived many crises in life. We have learned to solve complicated problems. We have developed instincts to detect when something is not right. The third lesson is that a united family is the best protection against any type of abuse or scam. If I had been truly alone, if I hadn't had my son Bobby, my brother Scott, my grandchildren, my contacts in the government, Walter would probably have succeeded in his plan. But because my family trusts me and I trust my family, we were able to work together to unmask him. Many older women feel lonely and unprotected, but the truth is that most of us have more support than we think. We have children, grandchildren, siblings, neighbors, lifelong friends who are willing to help us if we know how to ask for their help. The problem is that sometimes we are ashamed to admit that we need help or that we are going through a difficult situation. The fourth lesson is that you should never underestimate the power of planning and patience. When I discovered that Walter was a liar, my first impulse was to scream at him, kick him out of my house, and call the police immediately. But I decided to take the time to plan carefully how I was going to handle him. That planning allowed me to get solid evidence of his criminal intentions, information about his accomplices, and the satisfaction of seeing him fall into his own trap. If I had acted impulsively, Walter would probably have denied everything, invented excuses, and perhaps even managed to escape without consequences. The fifth lesson is that seeking justice is not revenge, it is responsibility. I didn't capture Walter to get revenge on him, but to protect my family and other future families. Revenge is personal and destructive, but justice is social and constructive. Revenge seeks to cause pain. Justice seeks to prevent pain. When I decided to set a trap for Walter, I didn't do it because I hated that specific man, but because I understood that he represented a danger to many other women like me. Every day he remained free was another day he could scam and hurt other innocent families. The sixth lesson is that older women have a wisdom and a strength that society does not sufficiently recognize or value. Throughout my life, people saw me as Robert's wife, then as Bobby's mother, then as Arthur's wife, then as the grandmother of my grandchildren. They always defined me in relation to other people, but when I had to face Walter, I discovered that I was Mary Elizabeth Walker, a complete woman in her own right, with her own abilities, with her own intelligence, with her own strength. I discovered that I could be a strategist, a detective, an actress, and a bringer of justice when the situation required it. The seventh lesson is that it's never too late to learn new things about yourself. At 69, I thought I knew myself completely, that I already knew my capabilities and my limitations. But the situation with Walter taught me that I had skills I had never used, strengths I had never needed, a determination I had never had to show. This has made me think that perhaps many women my age have extraordinary abilities within themselves that they have never had the opportunity to develop. Perhaps we all have an inner warrior waiting for the right situation to come out and defend us. The eighth and final lesson is that age can be a huge advantage if we know how to use it correctly. Criminals like Walter believe that older people are easy targets because they think we are weak, confused, or desperate for company. But the truth is that we have decades of life experience. We have developed very sharp instincts, and we have less to lose than young people. Besides, we have something that young people don't have: patience. When you're young, you want immediate results, you want to act fast, you want to solve everything at once. But when you're older, you've learned that the best solutions require time, planning, and strategy. That patience was exactly what allowed me to unmask Walter so effectively. And now, for my final words, I want to speak directly to the wonderful women listening, especially to the sisters, the mothers, and the grandmothers over 50 who might be feeling alone, invisible, or helpless. Listen to me. You are not weak. You are warriors. You have walked through economic storms, raised children with your own hands, nursed husbands back to health, faced loss, and crushed it under your heel. Every line on your forehead is a story of resilience. Every scar on your heart is a badge of honor. So, never allow anyone to treat you like a victim. Do not let your loneliness or your kindness be taken advantage of. Your dignity is non-negotiable. Trust your inner compass. Experience has given you a radar that is never wrong. If something feels wrong, it is wrong. Act on it. Asking for help is not weakness. It is the wisdom of a general who knows when to call for reinforcements. Look at me. I started as Mary, the abandoned wife. Then Mary, the single mother. Mary, the widow. But today, I stand here as Mary, the woman who refuses to be trampled on. Mary, the woman who brought justice. Mary, the woman who proved that at 69 years old, a woman is a force of nature. That strength is not mine alone. It is inside every single one of you, waiting to be awakened. Because never forget, age brings wisdom. Experience builds power. And a woman who has walked through the storms of life is an unshakable force when she decides to fight for what is right. May God be with you and give you strength. Thank you for listening to my story. If this message resonated with you, let's build a community of strong women together. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment to let me know where you're watching from. We'll see each other in the next story.